Afternoon. Welcome. I'm Dr. Nicole Turner Lee. I am Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. I'm glad that you all could join us today, and particularly for a topic that I think all of us have top of mind, particularly those of us that watch the artificial intelligence trends. And the conversation we're going to have today is around responsible AI. What exactly is it? And let me tell you why that's important to the work that I do at Brookings. At Brookings, I work on a range of telecommunications issues as well as tech policy issues, and I hold a portfolio in artificial intelligence. And in the space of artificial intelligence, I'm particularly interested in algorithmic bias. So when I think of responsible AI, I think of these words like ethical. I think of the words like transparent and fairness. I know I've added lawful to it. And there are other folks who have put among the umbrella of responsible AI a lot of different factors. But I'm a sociologist. And so whatever I think about responsible AI is often, incurred because of my background academically. So I'm really excited about this conversation because you all who follow my work and have been looking at what I'm trying to do with this Energy Star rating know that I'm all about interdisciplinary conversation. So today, we're going to have a conversation with folks that I think represent three distinct verticals in the responsible AI space. We're joined today by Natasha Crampton, who is the Chief Responsible AI Officer at Microsoft Corporation. We also are joined by Will Hurd, who is a former member of Congress, and Julia Stoyanovich, who is the Assistant Professor at the New York University Tandem School of Engineering. And Julia, I apologize. I'm a New Yorker as well, and sometimes my R's and my O's and my N's get all mixed up. But I want to thank all of you for joining us today. So we're going to jump right into this conversation. Let me remind those of you who are listening to please submit your questions to events@brookings.edu and on the hashtag AI bias. Let's jump right into this conversation, if you all don't mind. Welcome. Natasha, I want to start with you. And I want to start with you because I think you can help us from the industry perspective on framing what is responsible AI. So first, tell us what you're tasked with, because I've been around for a long time. I've not heard of a Chief Responsible AI Officer. So would love to hear a little bit more about what you do. And then I'd like to hear what you think of when you think about this concept of responsible AI. Thanks for joining us too, Natasha.
Thanks, Nicole. My job in a nutshell is really to put Microsoft's AI principles to work across the company. We established our principles back in 2018 to really set the North Star for our effort, and they're aligned with the many sets of principles that have been issued since then. So we're focused on fairness and reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency and accountability. So since 2019, when our Office of Responsible AI was established, I've been really working with colleagues across the company to operationalize those principles, which is really to say that I've been working to define what it means in practice to uphold our principles. Much of our efforts really been focused on four big building blocks. First, a governance structure to enable progress and accountability, rules to standardize our responsible AI requirements, training and practices to promote a human-centered mindset, and tools and processes for implementation. Our responsible AI governance model really borrows the hub and spoke approach that has worked well across the company to integrate privacy and security and accessibility into our products and services. So in our hub, we have three groups: Ether, whose research-led working groups help us understand the state of the art with respect to our principles; the Office of Responsible AI, which I lead, which sets our policies and our governance processes and coordinates the effort across the company; and a third group, which is called RAISE, Responsible AI Strategy and Engineering, which is really helping our engineering teams to implement responsible AI practices through systems and tools. And so these three groups work together to set a consistent bar for responsible AI across the company. And we empower the spokes in our engineering and sales teams to drive initiatives and be accountable for them. Another part of my job is to actually write the rules to enact our principles. And we do this via a document that we call our Responsible AI Standard. We published the first version of this in fall 2019. really with an eye to learning and a very humble recognition that we were at the beginning of our journey to move from principles to practices. Our pilot teams really appreciated the examples of how the responsible AI concerns could materialize, but they struggled with the open-endedness of the considerations, and they were really thirsty for more concrete practices that they could follow. So towards the end of last year, we began previewing a second version of our responsible AI standard with teams. And this time we have asked teams to work towards requirements that ladder up to goals. And we know that our engineers are problem solvers. So we really think this goal-driven approach is going to help engage their problem-solving instincts. So with that little bit of flavor for the sorts of things we've been doing internally, I'm going to turn to the second part of Nicole's question, which is, why is responsible AI such a focus, and why are there roles such as mine starting to emerge? And for me, I think it really boils down to two reasons. First, it is completely clear that AI is one of the most transformational technologies of our time. We know that it has the potential to help us with some of the world's biggest challenges, but it cannot achieve that potential if people do not trust it. And to build that trust, we have to really proactively lay the groundwork to secure its benefits and anticipate and guard against where it might go wrong as much as possible. And the second reason I think these sorts of roles are starting to emerge is that the types of issues we need to consider with AI systems are quite fundamentally different to the issues we considered when we were doing more traditional forms of software development. We're asking our teams to think about their systems not just in a purely technical sense, but in a socio-technical sense. And so that requires a new muscle. It requires new processes and practices and tools to help guide this work. So I do think with those two factors combined, you're going to continue to see roles such as mine crop up in organizations, and they're going to share this common thread of helping to build a culture and a practice of responsible AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so interesting, right? Because I think we saw a similar trend with privacy. For a long time, we didn't see chief privacy officers, and now we're seeing chief responsible AI officers. But I think and I want to talk about this a little bit more as we get through the conversation. I think you lay out what some of us, we have more of the definitional side of it, but you laid out the governance side. So how do you take these principles into action? And it sounds like that's from some structural changes, collaborative workmanship, as well as some cultural values, which I think is interesting because in the work that I've done, you see a lot of companies often put together piecemeal strategies to figure this out. So I want to come back to this governance side shortly. I know you don't want me to call you Congressman, but I am for the sake of this, just the beginning. Congressman Hurd, you've been active in this. I mean, before you left office, I had the great, humble privilege of working with you on the Bipartisan Leadership Council on the AI principles. And the BPC really took a look at that with you and Congresswoman Kelly as you start to think of what does AI look like on the public policy side or the government side. Share with me, what you're thinking about when you see this term of responsible AI and how you've actually taken that, because before you left, you also put out some legislation to sort of think about responsible AI from the government perspective.
Sure, Nicole, it's great to be on with you and such a smart group of people. So I apologize for the ham-handedness of some of my answers because I'm nowhere near as intelligent as the rest of y'all. This was not something I thought I'd be involved in, right? My degree's in computer science. Yes, I thought I was going to be a software engineer, and then I got exposed and decided to go, into the CIA and recruited spies and stole secrets all over the world. It was a great job, and I got frustrated with Congress and decided to run. And I got put on a committee because I was the only member of Congress that had a computer science degree and helped build the cybersecurity company. And so I've kind of got dragged into this. And what I've come to learn, and especially through this work with the Bipartisan Policy Center and my good friend Robin Kelly, to me, responsible AI, what we're trying to get to is artificial intelligence that follows the law, period. Right? To me, it's that simple. And we already have rules and regulations on the book. I've learned this from you, Nicole. And so we already have these rules and regulations. So when it comes for a digital tool that interacts with the physical world, we have laws. So let's just follow those laws. And if there is a unique scenario in which it's something that's purely digital, and I don't know many examples, I don't have any on the top of my head, then maybe we may need new laws for that. But let's make sure the tool itself follows the law, and then the application of the tool follows the law. So for me, that's responsible AI. And then the future is that responsible AI just becomes AI, because the term means it's going to be following the law and doing things that are right and proper. Now that's a simple explanation, but how do we get to that point? That's the difficult part, where we need the smart engineers that are looking at the data and the rules within the algorithms and how you train these things. And so for me, that's, and guess what? Congress is actually built to answer some of these questions, right? And so the role of our elected officials is making sure that our regulatory agencies are applying the existing rules and laws to their use of AI, that they're protecting data the right way. So that's how I look at this perspective and come to these conclusions from my time in Congress.
Yeah, look, you know what I feel about that. And I think most of the people who have been watching my work, I think that there is, like Natasha said, this governance around it. There's obviously this ethical nature of the AI, the transparency of the AI. But my friends, it has to be lawful, right? We cannot have these mistakes. And this is something that Will and I talked a lot, which is, how do you make the new digital world compliant with anti-discrimination? And if you can't, let's figure out how to do that, because people should not be denied housing, a loan, or any other critical service because the algorithm or the AI in itself violates what's already been litigated by groups. So, I'm gonna come back to that, right? Because I think that is such an important part of this conversation. But let me go to Julia first, because Julia, I know that you're like tiptoeing between the two of these spaces, right? Your work at NYU is all about democratizing AI. I've been just fascinated by what you all have been doing, both at the local level, but then also at the academic level. Where do academics fall with this? Because we've heard industry, we've heard government, and now where's the academy when it comes to responsible AI and unpacking this?
Thank you for that question, Nicole, and it's such a pleasure to be on this panel. So to start, I actually just want to say that we all, I think by definition, are outside our comfort zone when we talk about responsible AI. It's just such a heavy topic. It's AI, technology, right? Something that is very, very difficult for us to become comfortable with, even for the technologists among us. But then there's also the responsibility and the ethics. So I don't think that there exists a person in the world today who would say, I'm perfectly comfortable with a conversation on responsible AI, and in fact, I'm an expert, right? So I think that for us to become sufficiently comfortable with this topic, to embrace it as people, to be able to make progress in this really, really difficult space, there are a couple of things that we need to do. And one of these, and I hope that we will be able to do this on this panel today already, is to disagree and to fight and to have very, strongly worded and enthusiastic conversations about this, and even maybe disagree with ourselves, right? 5 minutes later. This is something that we academics are really, really good at saying, I have no clue, and yet I have a very strong opinion about something. And the other thing that I think we need to bring into the conversation, again, to make sure that we get a handle on this responsible AI thing that is all the rage, is we have to laugh about it. We have to laugh about ourselves. We have to bring humor into the conversation, because one of the salient differences between people and machines is that machines don't have a sense of humor, last I checked. And we do, right? So to make a topic human, let's be human in this. So what is my definition of responsible AI? I don't really have a good definition, but I'm going to try to at the same time agree and disagree with Will. So I'll agree in that I've also been thinking about what this Center for Responsible AI at NYU is, and what our mission is to make ourselves obsolete in a few years, to make it so that responsible AI becomes synonymous with just AI, and no one talks about responsible AI anymore. So there we are in agreement, but I disagree that responsible AI is just legally compliant AI. I think that there's much more to that conversation, meaning that perhaps a better way maybe to put this is, how do we make AI socially sustainable? And this includes, of course, legal compliance, but it also includes us as people wearing whatever hats that we wear at the moment, an individual, a mother, an academic, a member of the public at large. How do we make it so that we are able to participate and to exercise our ethics and to bring our values into the conversation about AI? So to speak maybe a little bit about the role that I see for academics and for academic institutions in this space, of course, the primary mission of an academic institution like New York University is an educational mission and also a research mission. And in this topic of responsible AI, education and research coalesce, and they reinforce each other. Because when we start thinking about responsible AI, and we start thinking about responsible technology, responsible computing more generally, we of course have to make strides to both educate the practitioners, but also educate members of the public. And then there's also a lot of research that is at these interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary boundaries of technology and policy and law and social psychology and social science, et cetera, et cetera. So we're never bored. Now, I'm, of course, a technologist, right? I'm a computer scientist by training, and I'm an engineer. So as engineers, we build. And I very much have an engineering mindset. And the style of research that I personally find most appealing is when we do research that is driven by practical demands. Nothing wrong with basic research, but I think that here we actually have a responsibility to respond to what the world is asking of us right now. And in my view, the biggest gap right now is not in the availability or unavailability of sophisticated data collection and data analysis methods. To be very extreme here, to make an extreme point, I'd even say we don't need new algorithms right now. And this must sound really strange coming from a computer scientist, right? Developing new algorithms is our bread and butter. This is how we publish and therefore survive. So we don't need new algorithms. But what we do need is to understand how to make the algorithms that we have equity aware. And this is a term that I actually prefer to responsible these days. How can we embed ethics and policy constraints, for example, into the systems that we have? And here again, I will agree with Will, who said, well, legally compliant, right? We have laws that exist, but maybe we need to change laws. So I'm also contradicting myself when I say that we don't need new algorithms, because of course, just taking an algorithm such as it is and fixing it a little bit to now become legally compliant is not going to work. Instead, really, we need to rethink the entire stack. And then there is another gap, of course, that is very important and that we have to fill with our educational mission. And that is, how do we make people algorithm aware? How do we teach people at different levels about what algorithms can and cannot do? And how do we create this deliberation with as many stakeholders as possible at the table about what algorithms should and shouldn't do? What shouldn't we be asking algorithms to do? So the Center for Responsible AI at New York University at NYU Standen School of Engineering specifically focuses on applied research, where the goal is to build these systems that embed equity as a primary objective. The work we do is never purely technical, and it always involves education of data scientists, of policymakers, of members of the public. And it involves the research and the practice of public participation and public engagement, and a deep commitment to helping shape policy, which we have so far been doing mostly at the local level in New York City. And the goal there is really to help make technology work for all of us, not only for the select few.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, look, I want to go, Will, I want to give you this opportunity to respond back. And then I have a couple of questions I think that will trail into Will and Natasha, because I think you bring up a lot of really interesting things, Julia, which in my work is actually similar, which is having these become much more participatory models that we actually develop, and the extent to which we actually look at improving upon the performance of algorithms versus creating ones that continue to skew. But I do want to go back to Will on this whole legal compliance thing, because I do think that there's a difference between building algorithms from the engineering side that you hope are going to be legally compliant, or building algorithms. So, for example, some of the pragmatic and practical examples is building algorithms that exclude. Because when you build it to exclude from a technical cadence, right, you then go out of sort with advertising or fair credit housing, employment laws. So, Will, I just want to give you a chance to respond. And then, Natasha, I want to come to you about this whole thing, because part of this conversation we're having for the three of you is about fairness. So I want to come back to you and really talk about, can we really define fairness, which actually leads to the big goal, or the big question mark. Will?
Look, I thought Julia's point on making humans algorithm aware is important, because we're going to have AI that's going to be able to write code. Okay, so once you have that, then what should you be using it for? And these are some basic questions. It's funny, the longer I go in my career in public policy, the more basic my questions become. And so it's like, what is the role of the United States in the rest of the world, right? What percentage of GDP should be used on healthcare? Like these are some simple questions, but to get to an answer is really hard. And that's why we need engineers taking classical liberal arts education. We need people that are in liberal arts taking some basic software development classes and understanding some of these concepts, because the two things are interrelated, and you have to have people that have a grasp of both of those in order to answer some of those questions. And look, I don't disagree with anything that Julia said. I think the laws that we have is a starting point, and if we need to make things better, that's the standard by which we evaluate things. And so I actually believe that artificial intelligence could be helping us make better decisions and applying the law in a more fair way, rather than being the use case that manipulates that. That would be a golden, that would be if I had my magic wand on a position that we actually get to.
Yeah, and that's why I love this conversation. I always tell people at Brookings and the external world that the longest paper that I ever wrote was with an engineer, a sociologist myself, and a lawyer. That paper felt like it never ended, right? But it was actually the best paper that I wrote, because I actually got to see things from their perspective. And Natasha, one of those things that we actually, and I love the way Julie said, we argued about, was this whole idea of fairness, because fairness is so elusive. When you think about fairness as a term, I mean, how do you operationalize that, particularly from an industry perspective? What do you do to make fairness look like a metric versus, something that people want to strive for? And then I'll have Julia and Will jump in.
Thanks, Nicole. I really do think fairness is the perfect principle to use to illustrate these things that we've just been talking about. It is, of course, one of our AI principles. In fact, it's the first of them. It's a core focus of our responsible AI standard. It's part of our culture. And yet, from my perspective, it represents one of the hardest and most pressing challenges in this space, particularly when it comes to trying to operationalize the concept. So we have teams working through different types of fairness harms here at Microsoft. We focus on 3 types of harms. Quality of service harms, so this would be, an example of this is where you might have a facial recognition system that works really well for some demographic groups and poorly for others. Allocation harms, so you can imagine a system that sort of unfairly allocates employment opportunities to one group at a higher rate than others. And then we also try and think about representational harm. So this might be when a model generates output that reinforces stereotypes, or it continues to sort of over or underrepresent certain groups. And we really start with having teams think about deeply, in a way that they may not have in the past, who their stakeholders are for the particular system that they're building. And the way that we do that is through an impact assessment. And we ask teams to think broadly about where and how and for whom the system's being built, so that they can build out a picture of, what things might go right, but probably more importantly, what things could go wrong and for whom. We then have teams having identified sort of demographic groups that might be affected by the system. We do have them think very carefully about the data sets that they're using to train and test their algorithms. And we've got, various tools that we use to try and analyze the composition of those data sets, because we want to make sure that, the data sets reflect the diversity of the world in which we live. But it goes beyond data. Sometimes the discussion about fairness really heavily centers just on data. But as Julia was alluding to, when we're building models, we make lots of choices about features, about model structures, about objective functions, and about training algorithms. And in each of those design decisions that we take, we need to prioritize fairness at every point. We do have some tooling that we use to try and help detecting and sort of mitigating fairness issues earlier. So we've got a couple of open source tool sets that we've developed here at Microsoft. One's called FairLearn and others called Error Analysis. That do help with certain fairness challenges, but I think it's fair to say that the tooling in this area is still pretty nascent, and there's a lot of work as a community that we need to do to try and build that out further. Now, of course, testing needs to be done in the real world, in the context in which the system is going to operate, and not just in the labs, because it's very often the case that results in the lab don't reflect the reality or the range of scenarios that really occur in the wild. And you've got to keep testing throughout deployment and make sure that you're uncovering issues that might emerge in the real world. And I think critically, decisions that we take when we're trying to build out fairness across this life cycle do require transparency, because people at the end of those systems need to understand them. And to Julia's point, the limitations that they place on the system when you take certain decisions as you're building out a system. So that's a sort of overview of the life cycle based approach that we try and take here at Microsoft. But in the spirit of acknowledging what Julia said about the challenges here and what we know and what we don't know, there's certainly a few areas that I would point to that are very real and present challenges for operationalizing fairness. The first thing I would say is that fairness is deeply contextual. As has been discussed in much of the literature in this space, there is no single definition of fairness that works well in all circumstances. And the context is really critical. It matters how and when the system will be used. So while, of course, a general objective of a program such as the one that I run at Microsoft is to sort of deeply study particular scenarios and see whether you can generalize out and find a pattern that you can apply to other scenarios, fairness doesn't always lend itself to that type of generalization. And we've found that, things that we've learned in the context of working on the fairness of our facial recognition systems doesn't always generalize out even to, say, a speech-to-text system. And so that contextual nature of fairness is really something that is critical to recognize, but it's also a challenge in this space. I would also say that there are very few norms around methodologies and measurement right now when it comes to fairness, and I think actually the responsible AI space more generally. So when our engineers are working on fairness testing, they are eager to use industry standard methodologies or to understand what good or excellent looks like in terms of the fair performance of their systems, but there aren't really standard metrics for that today. A lot of the AI benchmarks that we see are quite focused on technical performance aspects. So, they might refer to accuracy in the sense of precision and recall, but we really need to together build out these benchmarks to make sure that they better take into account the sort of socio-technical considerations that we're trying to measure. How can we weave the fair performance, the transparent performance of a model into benchmarks that we hold up as industry standards? And then finally, I'll just say that there are certain types of fairness issues that are still genuinely research problems. So I mentioned earlier that we work on quality of service harms. Those are quite well understood in terms of how we might be able to identify and mitigate those sorts of harms. But representational harms, these are the situations where a model might generate stereotypes or over or underrepresent groups. There are still lots of open research questions there. And we really shouldn't even try, in my opinion, to move to mitigating those sorts of harms until we deeply understand what the challenges are. So I think I'd close by saying that, we need to continue to recognize where research questions lie, and we need to support the research community in their efforts to help us better understand them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Natasha, thank you for laying that out. This whole idea that fairness is contextualized, because I actually say the same thing, that there are not enough norms. And this kind of goes back, I think, what Julie was saying, that it kind of intersects with the reputational side. Some of the norms are mainstream norms. They're not even built on the lived experiences of the people that are affected by the technology. And then I would say third, yes, and it kind of goes back to Will said, I think as a legislator, he's looking at the black box outcome. And I think what Julie was sort of suggesting, you got to start with equity. So I think what everyone has said so far is been interesting. And Julie, I want to come to you, right? Because one of the areas, in addition to facial recognition, that we see a lot of this discussion is in employment AI. And that is becoming, I think, the big pressure cooker when we think about, and I love it, people, that you all are using the word socio, because my mother always wondered what I was going to do with a sociology degree. But the fact that we can look at employment algorithms and see that these proxies of face and zip code are being used. As a sociologist, we studied that years ago when we identified Black sounding names like LaTanya Sweeney's work suggests, or zip code, or the fact that now you can see a person's face doesn't provide for blind interview. So talk to me a little bit about that, because I know, Julie, in New York, you're actually working on that and globally with your work in terms of putting fairness into employment AI and hiring.
Yes, happy to. But I also wanted to ask, Will, did you have something quick to add before we dive into this new? Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Julia. The only thing I was going to say is what complicates everything that Natasha said is you're not going to get any direction for government on some of these questions, right? And so all the companies are having to develop these things themselves, which means you have to be putting what is best for the customer, and it's not always what's best for the company. And I'll use opt-in versus opt-out. Yes, as a company, you want someone to have to opt out because you got them, right? But nobody who's ever clicked unsubscribe thought that their information was going to stay there. And then, unsubscribe me and you can hit me in 9 more months, right? And so those are some of the decisions that businesses that are developing these are going to have to make. But thank you, Julia.
Absolutely. And this time I really have trouble disagreeing with anything that either Natasha or Will said. So let's see if we can stir up a bit more controversy going forward. So I want to pick up from where Natasha left off with the allocation harms. And this, of course, is a very nice way to categorize the different types of harms, right, Natasha, that you already discussed. And as much as we can do to categorize things, to try and put things into boxes, we should always attempt to do that, while still, of course, recognizing that these boundaries between boxes are not very strict. So when talking about fairness in allocation harms, I think that we have been overly focusing on fairness in outcomes. Who gets hired and who doesn't get hired? Do we have enough women or enough people of color being represented among the finalists, for example, in a job interview round? And we have been assuming that in an effort to fix, and I'm going to use air quotes here, bias in outcomes, it is somehow justified to make the process by which we arrive at these outcomes arbitrary and uncontestable. And at a slightly more general level, we have been operationalizing fairness as something that is a property of a data set or of an algorithmic process. And this is not at all a productive point of view. And this is something that Natasha spoke about as well already by discussing the kind of life cycle view of automated decision systems and fairness as it pertains to the entire life cycle and how as it interacts with transparency and explainability, right? But another life cycle that is important here, in addition to the data collection, data analysis, deployment, is also this life cycle of the design, development, deployment, and oversight of automated decision systems. So when we think about fairness, I do really believe that it's not productive for us to be limiting ourselves to a frog's eye view of data set, model, output. and then you notice that something happens where your output is gender biased or it's racist, as in not selecting enough people of a particular demographic or socioeconomic group. And then the only thing you can do if that's your worldview is tweak the output, tweak the box, tweak the input, right? And this really limits what you can do. So another way to put this is that this myopic sort of view, it's not productive because it dismisses the before and the after, the socio-legal technical context in which these systems operate. So let me give an example now, of course, prompted by Nicole, and thank you for this prompt, and that is the use of algorithmic hiring tools. These tools, the promise that they make is that hiring and job search, so hiring for employers and job search for job seekers, is going to be made more efficient. Less paperwork, you somehow are going to be able to find candidates who are well qualified for your job very quickly. And you as a job seeker are going to be able to find all positions that are a good fit with a click of a button. But importantly, we also hear this argument that the use of algorithmic tools will help us improve workforce diversity. And this is, the argument goes, is because humans are biased when they hire, and there's plenty of evidence to that effect. We have no choice but to use machines to step in and hire on our behalf. And this, in my opinion, is a very, very dangerous premise. It's a very dangerous point of view to hold. And normally, this is where I go into my soliloquy that today I will avoid about how, because humans are biased, and then when we hire, we're going to embed essentially the bias that their hiring decisions have been having on the world in the data that we get. And then because our data exhibits this bias, we train algorithms and they will give us biased models, et cetera, right? But ultimately, of course, it's not very easy to debias algorithms. It's not very easy to debias data sets because we just don't understand. The data set doesn't know whether it's biased and for what reason. Is it a bad reflection of a good world, a good reflection of a bad world, or are these distortions compounding, right? But so the point here, though, is that although we talk and think about bias a lot, even if a tool is designed that helps us improve the diversity of the applicants being considered, let's say at some step in the hiring process, if, for example, it admits a sufficient number of candidates of each required demographic or socioeconomic group, but the decisions of this tool are otherwise arbitrary, then can this tool really be considered fair? What if these decisions are worse than arbitrary? What if the tool is picking up signal like a person's disability status, and we have no way to know that this is happening? What if it's measuring something about a job applicant that we have no reason to believe to be relevant for the job for which they are applying? Like, are they able to pop balloons quickly enough in a video game, right? I mean, why is that relevant? And so where do we go from here? I think where we go is that an integral part of this conversation about fairness is also making sure that the tools that we are building and deploying actually work by some definition of work. And these tools, of course, are engineering artifacts, right? We build them to some specification. And so we should not take the claim that they work on face. Nobody who's ever built a car or a bridge would say, it works. Believe me, you have to actually show that it doesn't crash and it doesn't endanger the lives of people, right? So to know whether algorithmic tools work, we should similarly use the scientific method. And that is very simple. We formulate a hypothesis that states in a falsifiable way that the tool indeed, in this case, selects employees who do well on the job and who, in fact, do well on the job in a way that is better than if you were selecting them with a random coin flip or a bunch of random coin flips. So comparing performance to performance of essentially a random coin flip is the lowest bar. And this is not something for which we have right now a standard. And I think that that's just really worrisome. And then beyond the definition of works, which is just better than a coin flip, we should also, of course, pay attention to the impacts that these tools have on different stakeholders. And Natasha spoke about this already with impact assessments, right? Fairness of outcomes by gender or by race, which is what our legal frameworks will tell us that we should be compliant with, is not sufficient. It's not a sufficiently high bar. What about intersectional groups? What about Black women, right? We don't currently have a requirement that tells us to hire enough Black women or enough disabled people of color. What about individuals with disabilities, right? They may not disclose, and they often don't disclose their disability status when they apply for a job. And so we cannot audit for bias in this case because we just don't have that information.
That's right. That's right.
Yep. And so we cannot guess ultimately what the actual or potential harms of such tools are by just having just some people at the table. Yeah. No matter how smart these people are and how dedicated they are, we have to incentivize and solicit input much more broadly.
Yeah. Natasha, I want to stay on this, right? Because I think what Julia did was she just brought us back to square one in terms of how difficult and complicated this space is. And then, Will, I have a really super question for you that I want to ask you as a legislator. But Natasha, how would you respond to that? At the end of the day, no matter how you put it, it seems like fairness is going to continue to be elusive, but I know you've given us a framework for at least how we can measure what that fairness looks like. I mean, are we talking more about a lean towards standards or, any response to what Julia said?
I do think we need to move towards standards. And I think Julia's idea about sort of putting forward hypotheses that can be falsified and tested against is a good one. Another similar approach that we try and take internally is that, we try and ask teams to make sure that they have evidence to support the claimed benefits of their AI systems. And, sometimes this catches people by surprise because they sort of think, well, but of course my AI system with its, magical powers is going to be better than a human being. But by actually asking for the rigor of the evidence, that's a really good way of testing whether a particular system is fit for purpose. So I do think this reinforces the need for standards. And the only way that we're going to be able to figure out how to develop those standards is to really roll up our sleeves and I think work through these hard problems together in the participatory way that is really essential here. So I think we are going to have to find these sort of exemplar use cases that illustrate different types of challenges and really roll up our sleeves and figure out how we might be able to make inroads here. Now, we are unlikely to be able to get to a state of perfection, but it is nonetheless a very important task. And I think by getting to standards, we'll be able to start to build some sort of public confidence in the systems. And we should be able to provide that kind of assurance. We should be able to have third-party auditors to be able to assess, the processes that a company such as Microsoft adopts to make sure that we've got a rigorous approach to these issues, and to be able to essentially prove that we are walking the talk and not just talking the talk. And that's, absolutely something that we do for privacy or security. And so we've really just got to do this hard, immediate work right now of really trying to peel back the layers of the onion and trying to find what some of these standards might look like.
Yeah. Just a really quick reminder, if you have questions, events@brookings.edu, or please provide it on #AI bias. This conversation, I can stay here all day. In fact, I want to take my seat and just become a participant because I think this has become a really interesting conversation, unpacking some of the challenges. But Will, I want to go to you because as a legislator, you said something earlier, which is, you can really hook on to this idea of consumer algorithmic literacy, right? But when you start to break down the models that have been presented, where does the legislator fall in this? How do they begin to unpack what part of it do they actually legislate? I heard Julia say something about outcomes, right, in terms of inputs versus outcomes. So just want to hear where you're standing, because I know that was your challenge when you would offer.
For sure. So I think it's like one of the places that I would start with is you have to be able to show how the algorithm made the decision. Like, I know it's hard. Everybody says, oh, these things are so complicated. But if that algorithm is going to have an impact on people, you're going to have to be able to explain why this happened. And because that company is going to get dragged in front of Congress, and you're going to have some engineer be like, we don't know, right? This is not going to work. Now, when it comes to in research development, I think that's a different scenario. But when it comes to actually deploying to consumers, then you have to be able to explain why that decision was made, right? And then is the point in which there's potential regulatory involvement or legislation, is it whenever that human made the decision, right, in that process? And it could be as far back in the design of the system or where. And I think that is one area. But this is so complicated. Like we look in Congress, we couldn't even get agreement on when somebody should be notified when there was a breach. It took Robin Kelly and I 3 years to pass a piece of legislation on the Internet of Things when everybody agreed on what the outcome was, right? So that's, trying to get even further down into the development of the methods or the tools. I think that's pretty hard. And guess what? I don't think we want Congress to mess up those, to get in the way and slow down the development of these tools. And my final point is, when we do talk about the fairness of outcomes, in some of these understand bias, you got to collect data that in some places you can't collect, right? In the EU, you can't collect on an application whether you are a Black female in some cases. So if you're not able to collect some of this data to ensure that there's equity in the process and how these tools, how are you going to get to that end goal of what was the phrase that was used? Equity, being equity aware. If you haven't collected some of that data on the front end, I don't know the answer to that. I'd love someone's insights on that. I bet you Julia has an opinion.
Yeah, and Julia, if you can just step into and Natasha, I'll throw this to you, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience on the EU. I mean, I think what Will is also describing is the EU scenario where they've become much more prescriptive, not just in the privacy standard, but they've also been prescriptive around AI. So just curious, is that where we're leaning in this conversation, or are we going to keep some fluidity for the type of self-regulatory modes that we could take on this issue, as well as some participatory involvement from the people who are being affected? So Julia, I'll go to you, and then Natasha.
Yeah, so just very quickly, there are limits to any single method of instilling responsible AI and responsible technology practices, right? So auditing certainly is a useful tool in the toolkit, but auditing is not going to take us all the way, because, as we already all mentioned, in the US as well, people cannot be compelled to disclose their membership in protected groups, right? So disability status, age, gender, race, all these things is not something that we can ask, but we cannot compel people to disclose. So the way that I like to think about this is in terms of creating distributed accountability structures, strengthening our collective accountability in help make sure that the way that we use technology, AI in particular, is responsible. So returning to the definition of responsible AI, whose responsibility is it? It's every single one of us, but it's not computers, right? Computers actually cannot take responsibility. They don't have free will, so they cannot be held accountable for things going right or wrong. But we each have to participate in keeping these systems in check. And I will give just very quickly an example of how this might work that also takes us and kind of connects the thread with the standards conversation. I do think that we need standards, but more than standards for fairness, I think we need standards for disclosure, for public disclosure, specifically about the use of algorithmic systems that impact people. And a way that I like to think about this is using this metaphor of a nutritional label, where we show to an individual being impacted, for example, by an algorithmic hiring system, that they weren't hired because they weren't able to tell apart quickly enough red squares from green squares on the screen. And then the person can speak up and say two things. First of all, I'm colorblind, and so you are discriminating against me based on my disability. And secondly, this is not something that is relevant for the job. My job does not require me to tell apart green shapes from red shapes. And so this gives a person an actual way to contest the decision, both in terms of relevance, but also in terms of discrimination. So I think that when we work towards standards, the standards we should be thinking about is standards for public disclosure, standards for public education, developing a standardized process for agreeing in a society about what we should be exposing about a tool. What definition of fairness matters to us? So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Natasha, jump in, and I want you to pick up the EU-US question, because I think that's been actually bubbling among our listeners as well. So they have standards when it comes to AI. I think many of us at Brookings are still getting through the report. Can you discuss the EU regulations on AI and how that's going to impact the US as well?
Sure. One of the observations I had as I was working my way through the European proposals is that there are actually some parallels between the approach in Europe and some of the approaches that we've seen bubble up here in the US. And by those approaches, I mean, the algorithmic accountability bill that Senators Wyden and Booker and Representative Clark advanced, and we've seen sort of similar counterparts arise in some of the states as well. Both those types of proposals plus the European one really center on high risk systems, and there is actually a degree of sort of transatlantic overlap in the types of systems that are considered high risk. And there also seems to be a bit of implicit recognition on both sides of the Atlantic that regulation should fill gaps in existing legal frameworks. Now, the size and shape of those gaps is pretty different in the US and in Europe. But I do think this idea of a gap analysis and building from existing law is the right approach. I think the European proposal then goes deeper in a couple of respects. So first of all, it does start to tackle this notion that Julia advanced of distributed accountability, because it does try to go into the allocation of responsibilities across different actors in the supply chain. And it certainly sets out much more specific sort of design time, documentation, and testing obligations that providers of high-risk systems have to follow. As we've been building out our own internal practice of responsible AI, we've had to think about what those specific obligations look like. And when we've adopted new practices, we've challenged ourselves to always keep asking a few questions. One of those is, how will this practice lead to a more trustworthy system? Are these practices practical and proportionate and achievable? Do they actually generalize out across different types of systems? And do they take account of likely future technological directions? So I actually think that this set of questions that we ask ourselves internally is probably quite an instructive set of questions for policymakers to ask as well, including when we're looking at quite specific obligations, because we want to be sure that those specific obligations are actually meeting their policy objectives. Look, I think it probably is too early to say whether we will see another example of the Brussels effect here. On the one hand, the European proposal clearly is an ambitious one that has some of the hallmarks of the GDPR effort, but it has been really encouraging to see a real focus on transatlantic cooperation on AI policy. And I think that's something that wasn't really present at the time GDPR was being enacted. I do think we should take advantage of this current moment to make sure that the impetus towards transatlantic cooperation on AI policy is harnessed. I think we should try and move to a world where we do have harmonized rules based on shared values. We don't really want to end up in a situation where we have, conformity assessments or other forms of assurance that have to be repeated across geographies. And I think there is a real opportunity here to try and create systems of mutual recognition and cooperation.
Yeah, and I'm looking at one of the Twitter questions from my friend Mike Nelson, who says, we also probably need to agree on what is AI, because that's still something that is quite debated in the long term. Hey, Will, I'm going to turn this question over to you. How can philanthropy, professional, and trade associations play a constructive and meaningful role in advancing a responsible AI agenda? Because I know, you've thought about that as well as other stakeholders coming to the table.
Sure, and let me start this answer with two broader points that we haven't addressed, but I think they need to be said. We won't be able to define the rules if we don't own the technology, right? And so we are in a race, and the broader question is, can the United States and our allies keep up with the greatest geopolitical adversary, which is, in my opinion, the Chinese government, without becoming a data guzzling surveillance state, right? Like this is the broad issue, and we have to get these answers right so that responsible and ethical AI is what drives this industry in the future. And what other outside groups, philanthropic groups, trade organizations, is start explaining and showing to elected officials how artificial intelligence is impacting in a positive way or a negative way your own industry. And because I think every industry is different, how this unfolds in banking is different from construction. And so I think, educating those members, educating those staff, anybody who's involved in this, have you gone to your local member of Congress and talked to the district director or the chief of staff of that individual to start improving the basic education? It seems like such a simple thing to say, but there's a dearth of understanding up in Washington, D.C., and that's how these groups can help educate our elected officials on these issues.
Thank you for that. Julia, I'm gonna give you this question. This question is, as long as humans are involved, is ethical AI even a possibility? And if you could answer that in about 60 seconds, because we're running out of time, we could have added like easily another half hour or hour to this conversation.
The answer is yes. Yes, humans are always involved, and ethics is something that arises through deliberation, right? I mean, it's ethics that humans deliberate on. It's our values, it's our responsibility. So absolutely, without human involvement, I don't think we can have ethical anything, including ethical AI. Yep.
Yeah. Anybody else want to just respond to that in terms of without humans, is ethical even a possibility? So we get ready to wrap up.
I'm trying to achieve Julia's original request of being of some conflict, but I agree with her 100%.
Yeah, I do that as a moderator. I think I push you down to the deepest level of inquiry, and then we go from there. And I appreciate all of the listeners too with questions. I will ask one other question, and again, and then I'll wrap up. Natasha, trustworthy versus responsible AI, sort of like that humans and ethics, trustworthy and responsible. Is there a reason why we need to use responsible more than trustworthy?
Look, we've chosen to use responsible at Microsoft because we think it really sort of communicates clearly that it requires action on our part. Even at the most senior levels of the company, Microsoft President Brad Smith has said that if you're creating technology that changes the world, then you have a responsibility to help address the world that you have helped to create. So I think responsibility really does convey that there are acts, there are things that you need to do, and that there are consequences for not doing those things and carrying out what your obligations are. So I do think ultimately, they are closely intertwined. I mean, we also believe clearly that people don't use technology that they don't trust. But I think the notion of responsible does resonate for us because it extends to cover concepts as well, like reliability and safety, which some people might not think of as being, traditionally kind of ethical constructs, though there's, of course, a debate there as well. So for us, it really encapsulates a suite of issues plus our own obligation to take action.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you to all three of you. And before you all log off, let's just say thank you in a virtual applause to the three of you for taking your time. And I want to say to everybody who was watching, Brookings is talking about these issues. At the Center for Technology, which I run, we actually have an AI stream where you can find on the Brookings website a series of papers that deal with everything from governance to bias to national security. So I'd ask you to actually look at that. We've just published a new paper today. We also have a podcast, the Tech Tank podcast, where we actually talk about these issues as well and continue these conversations as we also look at how that intersects with what policymakers are thinking. But most importantly, in my own work, I think I'm very, very humbled to have the three of these folks here today, because I think at the end of the day, responsible AI is just one framework for looking at it. And as you've heard, underneath that are a range of adjectives. And the only one I would add that we didn't hear too much about is inclusivity. And as we go forward, let's make sure that that inclusiveness is actually part of the framing. And I'll just put a shameless plug. My Energy Star rating chapter is coming out soon so that you can actually see what I'm talking about with that. So with that, thank you for enjoying the afternoon with us. Thank you to everybody that is here. And we will see you at the next podcast. Will, Julia, Natasha, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.